Uh, so Egoed Badgers had a war. It was not close whatsoever. I'll probably just throw this on in the background for now. But Egoed basically for 20 minutes was not able to get a point. And then Egoed representing NA. Badgers, according to EU tier lists, generally not the best company, but a pretty good company. The other thing too is according to the EU tier list, who Micah made like today, Baguette is just par and Mangoed alt, so I wouldn't really count them. So it's really you have Mangoed, you have par, you have Ronaldo, and you have Badgers, and then these other companies I don't know exactly. But Ego is somewhere in that mix as like probably a fourth, fifth, I would say best, and then there's just a little bit of memeing here with some of the other companies, but generally that's like the position that Ego's in. It's like EU does not have a lot of good companies. They have probably four-ish, and then the rest are just kind of alt-based. So Ego's not bad, but they definitely did not have a good showing. The other thing from a high level is Ego actually got into Fort. I don't think when Para came to NA, they got 1 point when dropouts is not in VC, not calming, not doing anything. So that's about like what Ego felt like to EU, but EU actually got into Fort because they adapted and they changed. So props to Ego, they actually got a lot better there. But I'm just gonna throw this VOD on the background because it just kind of illustrates like most of the problems. Uh, this is Farmer John, by the way. Like, definitely check him out. He is a streamer for EU. He's pretty good. I followed him. I don't know why it doesn't say follow. But he is like a pretty good player. He has a lot of interesting builds. I'd say the first 3 minutes of this VOD, I was definitely like, I have no idea what this guy is running. And then after the first 3 minutes, it was like, oh, this makes a lot more sense. T-Baguette's not full of ults, it's X Hexagon. Okay, so maybe I'm wrong about that. So Ego's like fifth or sixth in from a EU perspective then. So it's like not bad, but not really good. From a NA perspective, Egoed would probably be the third best company. I think a lot of people would put Egoed in like A or S tier, depending on what you have, the highest tier for NA companies, but I would say that they're a tier below dropouts and Supple, because Egoed has done the thing where they've gone to every other server, they farm servers, and then they just disappear. But they've never actually beaten dropouts or Supple in the last year. They've never actually taken a fight versus dropouts or Supple for the last year, and for that reason, you can't really put them on the same playing field because they haven't played on the same playing field. And Ego's best players, they have like a really good top 5 to 10 like Ego core best players, but it's generally just Supple and dropouts. The main reason why NA lost was just because healers got farmed. If you just look at this and then you look at if I let's not sort by deaths, let's sort by healing. Okay, could you not error out when I'm going through this? If you sort by healing on here, which is just the stats of the war, and you start looking at deaths, then you can just start seeing like all these dark names are the NA players, and it's just like so many deaths for the top players. It's not even funny. Like you have healers that are averaging like between probably 10 to 15 deaths. It's just kind of at that point your bruisers can't play the game. The on Aura they technically beat several ults last year. Okay, but yeah, it's not recent, right? That's like it's still way too long ago to even like kind of consider to be the same because the companies have changed so much in my opinion. But I think the main thing is just you look at healer deaths and that's a big problem. The from a high level, like why they lost, uh TLDR of this VOD is bows are not actually playing this backline. I looked through Farmer's John's VOD. I think it took me 12 minutes, or no, it took me till 12 minutes in game. So it took me about 18 minutes to see my first bow user from the actual Egoed side. And then Egoed, they are running 4 bows, right? So this is like a very bow heavy comp. You expect your bows to do a lot. At this point, I can look at this because this has been leaked again, so it's like it's just in public discords. But the bow players from Egoed side are generally not the best bows in NA, to be honest. They like I would say they have top 15 bows in NA, but when you're talking about the 3 best companies in NA and you have like the top 10 to 15 bows slotted, like I don't think it's generally good. Like a few of these are good, but I don't want to start calling out names because that's just gonna get all nitpicky. Like the high level picture from Egoed, I'd say 15 to 20 players of their 50 are the best in slot players on their role in NA, maybe a little bit higher than that, but it's like in that area between like 15 to 25 are best in slot, and then I'd say 25-ish are pretty good, but you're defined by your bottom 25, so there's definitely like there in theory some problems there, and then there's some like obvious issues. Like I'm pretty comfortable like calling these guys out, but you have Kilosh on IG VG and you have Ant on BB, and that literally just needs to be switched. It's not because Kilosh Well, it is because Kiwash is just not as good as an IGVG as he is on BB, and Ant's pretty good at both. So it's like there's stuff like that where it doesn't really make sense. There's some like gear score stuff, but I don't really want to get into that specifically. It's mostly the bows did not show up to this war. Instead, you have people like the light greatsword, like schizo builds peeling backline. Like this is the first. Okay, this bow I didn't actually see last time, so he's there a lot sooner, but he's not actually like pressuring these guys out. It's just like kind of no flank control on the side from NA, and there's able Ego is just basically has our healers collapsed on for free, and that is kind of relates to the comp problem. So you look at the comp from an NA versus EU perspective. NA, they have 5 BBs. These are the main people controlling the backline. They have this group 9 controlling the backline, which in my opinion doesn't make a lot of sense. And then the group 10, from what I saw mostly, was playing Oppo their road to top. So it's just like generally not good. Because Bo's top just they need to like hard carry, and then from like a carry perspective, these are not like hard carry bows. Like Daw, Dreidel, OD are like the bows I think of when I think of like hard carry bows. Like you don't contest these guys. They're gonna drop 25 kills in your war. These are not hard carry bows. These are like kind of like they will get value, but it's like mostly like, to be honest, like kind of pad damage oriented bows, which is like the main problem that we had with EU coming to NA in the first place. Is the bows that from power that they sent to NA were generally padding and not actually doing that much. And this is the same problem that we have when you're sending bows across again. And there's like some issues there with ping and whatnot, and so some people don't want to like come because they don't think they'll do as well and whatever. So you kind of take what you can get, right? But you don't play for these four to like hard carry you at that point. You play for someone like Tej or Jeff to like hard carry you and go on healers. Like these guys will actually like confirm kills. It doesn't make sense for this group to be playing in backline. And Arch realizes that at a certain point here, but it takes so long for them to realize that it was just kind of mind-boggling. Because at this point you have 5 people realistically that can counter this group. I want to say Firestaff's already countered this group, and they have what? How many assassins do they have in Great Swords? They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So they literally have 10 Great Swords in the backline versus 5. You're just never winning that, especially because Great Sword kind of counters IGBB because of the Relentless Rush can go through Ice Shower, so you don't actually have that space control with IGBB, which is why you kind of need the bows to support them. So the bows kind of help them from a range perspective. When they get close, the BBs can help the bows. They kind of work off each other to a degree. There wasn't like that kind of balance aspect. Instead, NA like revolved around the front line doing better. So NA is just like playing for frontline to basically win at this point. And then from a comp perspective, you look at Badgers, you're never gonna kill this point team, but NA's just trying to kill the point team. The 3 assassins are bows. Okay, that's kind of, I don't know why they're named assassins then, but yeah, there's still like way too many assassins or assassins. There's too many great swords for the amount of people that are peeling for this back one without the bows. Basically, you have the bows back there. It fixes like 90% of the problems. The other problem is Egoed historically they played to collapse on point, blow up point, and then go wide. That doesn't work versus this point comp, and I think this is the only point comp in the game that doesn't really work versus, because IGBB isn't necessarily playing on point, right? They're playing to protect healers, so they're like a little bit off point or on edge. SNS with double single target, like you're never killing that guy, like ever. Especially because most of the Egoed players were not running bio. There's just like no way to mitigate that heal incoming, and that's just a big problem. That's something else that I can bring up because I can show this off now because it's been leaked. But the amount of detonates that Egoed has was very high, but they weren't doing like the basic things I saw with detonates, where you go for a detonate, someone stuns the guy so they can't dodge out. Like I was seeing really big detonate pushes. If I swap over to Sephia's point of view and kind of hop in the middle here, I was seeing like really big detonate pushes, but people weren't actually dying because they were just able to iframe out of it, and they would do like a 6 to 10 man detonate point wipe push that normally would wipe a point that would get 1 kill because they just weren't kind of fundamentally doing stuff how you would expect it, and then they would create a big ball and that would get collapsed on and people would get blown up like this. So it was just like kind of a combination of people not playing off each other and in general just forcing the issue, I guess. Like from an NA perspective, it's like, yes, you have the you should be able to win on point, but you're not going to win directly on point versus double single target heal SNS. That guy is just like way too tanky. So you need to find a different way to win, or you need to put Vang on SNS VG and play to bug the SNS when you actually go for the point wipe and then do that. But the SNS VG aspect where you play to bug the SNS, I think I'd say there's 3 VGs that I've seen do that. One is me, one is Lengod, and one is Jordan, and no one else seems to play for that mechanic super well, where they wait for the SNS to have to block, and then they drop the Obliv so the SNS block doesn't do anything. That's something I don't really see a lot, but that's another opportunity to play make there. Arch might be doing it. I haven't seen an Arch VOD in a while, but he's a very good VG, so he probably knows about it. And he was in a spot to be able to do that, I believe. Yeah, he was in a spot to be able to do that. He was on point. So maybe he was doing it, but I wasn't seeing that SNS dying from the EU side. And SNS from NA was generally living, but the SNS from NA was on Ice Gauntlet, not Great Sword, so they're inherently just getting less value. They're going to be able to live, even though they had more deaths. They're generally a more survivable build, but they're not consistently shielding where I thought he should be shielding, like Vang. Like there were so many of these fights where it's just like, where is everyone? And you just don't see Vang in the point fight, and uh, you just see Sefia like die a lot off of that, which is nothing against Vang. I think there's a lot of confusion against the like where people were going to, because like this respawn here, like respawns are going to A, right? But respawn to A is like a longer rotation than going to B, so it's just like the idea of like you split off to A, but then you want to put your respawns back to B, but your B is getting wiped, so people don't really know where to go because there's a lot of confusion off of that, and that wasn't super clear. The split was just very, very early forced. It looked very desperate. There wasn't pressure on B before they did the split, so the split inherently just doesn't work nearly as well, and that's like one of the main things with the split is you have to have some degree of pressure before you do it, or you need to do it when they don't really expect it. So this like A fight, Egoed 100% should have won because they got here first. They had time to set up, but they just aren't able to convert it into a fight win because their backline just gets super farmed. Because you start seeing bows that are playing up in the frontline areas, which I don't see as much from this point of view, but I definitely saw from Farmer John's point of view, where you just don't see bows in the backline because they're off somewhere else, and they're kind of not helping the army as a whole in terms of take carrying that backline. And when your heroes can't play the game, no one's able to play the game, especially when you have a comp that is super super heavy on melee that requires healers to have high uptime, and that's what Egoed has. So there's just like lots of issues that they're just like having from that perspective. So I'd say the point team generally lost, the outside team generally lost, and the healers were on farm. So yeah, it makes sense for them to not be able to do as well. If we actually like kind of skip to the part where they actually put their decks in their backline, which is like right around here, maybe a little bit after this, it looks super super clean. All of a sudden, there's like pressure on the other team's healers. They're able to collapse point and like start to get kills, but it takes them super super long to recognize that. And that's like the main reason why NA lost. Once they kind of recognized and made the switch, they won, which I think was something that separates Egoed from other companies. Other companies generally aren't able to adapt. Supple dropouts. They go into a war, they come out with a plan. If the plan doesn't work, they lose. Egoed is like the first company I've seen that's like in NA that's actually able to adapt at this. So that's like kind of props to Arch as like an entirety as like a shot caller because he's just like better at kind of adapting and those kind of other the calls that aren't like black and white on paper like the mid game calls. Arch I think is generally better at that than other companies, but I think the problem is pretty simple. It's just they weren't really peeling the back one, and when you don't peel for your healers, then stuff loses, and it's just kind of that simple. And because they were peeling for healers, or like kind of half peeling and then half not peeling, they weren't able to get pressure on the other team's backline. They weren't able to help their own backline, so they just naturally didn't have pressure off the point. uh, you kind of have to commit to one or another, especially versus like a comp that is like very, very outside oriented. Like when you have all these great swords, like you know the other team is going to be going for the outsides and for the backline. When they go for something like a Great Axe Warhammer comp, which is more like egoed, then you're playing from inside out versus this other comp is playing more outside in. So it's just something that they needed to recognize and deal with a little bit better with the bows. Play more conservative with the decks. Just expect your ball to win because your ball should win. Let your ball kind of get on the single target healers and kind of rally back to point. Maybe swap some of these BBs, in my opinion, off of detonate because I don't think medium BB with detonate really does anything except for puts a rend on yourself and just makes yourself a target to get one shot. I've seen some people get value with it, but it's generally on BBs with light. So I'm not really a big fan of BB with detonate. Like I think the fire staff with detonate at a certain point was a meme, but actually in theory can get value. I personally don't see how a medium like BB with detonate gets a ton of value, and I would rather see someone go bile, which is what you see and during these actual point fights themselves. If you actually look at the point in certain situations here, you just see biles. Every single one of those biles is the actual bile from Badgers. It's not the one from Ego. Ego is only running one bile, and you'll see like 3 to 4 come out. They'll layer on top of each other, so cleanse won't apply. So the um, Badgers will just naturally have an advantage when it comes to the heal kind of mitigation on top of having extra heals from the single target. But once Ego goes back one, a lot of those problems just kind of get solved. If I jump to like very late from Farmer's point of view, which might be better to see this than Cephia's, like he has to start kind of going to the back line. He can't actually just play directly in the front line, which is like already a telltale sign. They are very they're not trying at this point to be honest, but there is like a disconnect there of protecting the back line versus going for front line. And once that kind of split happens is when Ego's able to take advantage and actually like win off of things. I'm just gonna start kind of going down the giant list I wrote down at this point, but that's like the like the high level kind of takeaway. Yeah, so EU played back to front, so they played for the back line and then play for the front line, like off this comp. But they're inherently just not playing for that because they're not protecting back line, which means that they're just going to lose space off the flanks, which they did, and then it just got collapsed on naturally. So that just generally doesn't work. Versus a comp that they're running. So it's kind of like the idea is play to your strengths, right? Uh, if you have a comp that is more playing for the main ball, then you need to support the main ball, but the main ball is not going to get value if the healers aren't pressured. So it's like you kind of have to have a combination of both. But if your healers aren't able to live, then that's just naturally not going to work. So it's just like there's a lot of like little things there if you're playing for the point wipe and then going wide. But you need to have pressure on the other team's healers while stuff is happening, and that just wasn't happening. And there are a lot of players that were just kind of free roaming just by the nature of like where players were positioning. It didn't make a ton of sense to me. But I think that's just kind of off of like mostly who the bows are that are slotted. To be honest, it just kind of looked a little bit lost. Both ran in SNS. Vang was the one that Ego ran. He's on SNS IG, which is I think is a little bit more meta than SNS Greatsword at this point. But if you're on SNS Greatsword, you have double single target. That weakness of the Greatsword, where you can just get one shot, is kind of mitigated. Greatsword I still think is a little bit better outside if you have the double single target though. So I think that's just kind of fine. And they just kind of tried to monkey on point, not really on top of Vang, but they played in the area of point. You don't see Aang is like Dragon something is his character Dragon Flame, but you don't see him like in the giant clumps all the time. You see him like kind of on other clumps. He's generally in the right clump though. Like that's not the biggest issue, but there are people who are dying around him mostly I think because of like kind of the bile difference and the healer pressure difference is the two biggest things. But once the healer pressure problem solved, a lot of these problems kind of get solved. A lot of the respawns like earlier on they just naturally kind of got split between B and A, and you kind of need to pick a side. Like if you go to A, you need your respawns to come back to B. If you go to B, then you generally are kind of committing to B. To be honest, like you don't want to ping pong all the time, but if you ping pong a little bit when you have pressure on both, it's good. You just need to have pressure on both. Like the dropouts attack, not the last one, but the one before that versus supple, there was pressure on both with the sideman split of the best people in dropouts who are at that role, and they just consistently won that fight, which created pressure and allowed B to have numbers up. And then like when off of that, you didn't really see that like aspect of like winning the side point. It was just kind of losing both side points at the same time. So you're just naturally not going to create pressure off of that if you're not winning either point. And again, that just kind of comes back to the great sword versus kind of less peel oriented backline, which I'm like saying over and over and over again. But if you actually like look like later on here, then you see that Farmer's like somewhat contested at this point. But at this point these guys are just bait, right? They played for this point. They rotate off, and this is actually like good. They they've over rotated to the side point, and at this point this is like where they start losing B in the second here. Um, if that loads, I can skip to this one. They start losing B off of that rotate because they over-rotate the other side. The guys don't have cleanse. It's like the big thing that Farmer messes up because he didn't keep cleanse economy the entire war, so they're able to kind of get B, not for free, but like generally easier because there's less backline pressure on top of people actually playing for the backline a little bit more. And then when the rotate to A happens, Ego just wraps through the oppo side. They go on top of Badgers healers, which is like very traditional from Ego. That's just generally how they play it. They go on the other team's healers and they wrap towards point, and that generally works better than just playing for point first, I think. But it doesn't work versus versus EU's comp as well, because Greatsword generally is better at controlling space control. Because they can just ignore the melee duel and then they can just go on the healers and have more pressure there. They can go on the IGBBs, IGVGs have more pressure there. But the actual Great Axe Warhammer can bring the fight 2 point and have an advantage in that aspect versus the Great Sword just plays for flank control. So it's just like kind of using that aspect a little bit, controlling the area around the point, bringing it 2 point, trying to blow up the point once the healers are soft pressured and there's less stuff happening on point. I'd just like to see a little bit more biles being run, to be honest. Like even Vang, like he's slotted on vines for the sword. I know some of the melees that were running were running vines because they didn't get their gear up because they're just stupid. I don't know, and that needs to change as well. But it's like mostly the I think lack of bile on point just makes it super easy to keep these guys alive with a single target setup, and then the actual like healer pressure was very low, and then people had to play in the back line because of that. Like you have to remember too, like the reason why Para lost so hard in NA is because we NA can just ignore the Para people going in our back line, and the people that were in our back line were just peeled for by bows, they were peeled for by BBs. So there's just like a comp differential there, and then you need to compensate for that. Uh, and those the only people that can compensate for that from the EU side are great swords. Then once you have great swords basically peeling for other people in their backline, they've already lost. So it's kind of like you have to ego it to a degree, but the not there is like an aspect there where it's just there's not enough pressure in the back line for stuff to start working for the front line, if that makes sense. Like if you try to take a melee fight and then the melee has two healers single target healing them, you're just never gonna get the kill. So and when you're playing for point, which is what Ego's comp naturally has to do, they have to play for point. These backline groups were not existing in the backline as much. They kept having to like kind of come back and sort of peel, play for the edge. And they're also sent on like rotations to A or to B respectively depending on the situation. So there's just like not that kind of fluid aspect there. But I wouldn't say like there's like as big of like a skill gap from like ping as some people would say. Like the best player I'd say stat wise from this war, if I sort by deaths, which is gonna look awful. All the gray stuff here is egoed, but you have to remember all their heroes are on farm, right? So you expect to have like very high deaths at that point. The best player deaths wise is Dex Demon for Ecode, and Dex Demon's playing from West, right? So he has the worst ping out of anyone in the army. And he has the lowest deaths, and he's playing like in the kind of the worst spot because he's a off point group. He's just existing like fairly well. So it's like I don't think it's like a ping diff necessarily. It's just kind of the you have to start thinking ahead, which is something that players from like West that play on East kind of have done. I don't know if EU ever picked that up from going from EU to East, but you have to like start thinking a little bit ahead of like what is going to happen. Like your positioning has to be a little bit better, and you can't rely on mechanics as much. But it's mostly just again the healers are dying way too much. They're not getting peeled for enough, and there's not enough like pressure on the opposing side. If you actually look at uh Badger's deaths, they're very low, right? You don't expect bruisers to like end up in a spot where they have like 6 deaths in a war, 3 deaths, 2 deaths, 1 death. Like this is the majority of the army. The army is just not getting pressured. If you sort by kills, there's like a very big kill differential, but that's just kind of off of who is being slotted from the deck squad from Ego, to be honest. I would say that of like the people that are like the best in their slot, I would not say that there's more than like 1 or 2 of those from the deck squad on Ego as an entirety that would be like viable as the best in slot like kind of option. Like there are better options there. I'm not sure people just didn't come or if Ego didn't reach out to those people or whatnot, but that was like very apparent. Uh, but yeah, there's just like a big like different stat wise across the board, but that just comes back to healers on farm. If your healers are on farm, then they can't support the rest of the army. The rest of the army gets farmed. Why the rest of the army didn't support their healers? If they did that, they would lose all the space control. If you lose the space control, you just naturally kind of get farmed harder. But there are certain roles that can peel for them enough. Like a IGVG can break away from their group, go peel for backline. And if there's like a BB and a bow, then that guy's gonna die. Let me skip back to actually when that point takes, because like if you look at this from like a rotate perspective, something is like more different. You see the wrap actually coming from Ego. This is like more traditional. You see that they're kind of starting to get their footing. There's pressure on the backline. The backline from EU has to play more off in a corner, and then from there they kind of naturally lose space. The like the EU greatsword line like answers this pretty well, but they're off chasing like just like the fire staff, right? They're not actually responding quick enough. And then by the time they're able to respond, they've just lost 50-50. And this just kind of comes back to the egoing the healers kind of aspect. Like at a certain point, you can't play to protect your backline. You just have to play more offensively, and that's what Ego does here. They go on the other team's backline, they blow up the point. Once the point gets blown up, they get passive tick, and then everything starts to tick into favor in terms of Ego's comp because they have Great Axe Warhammer. They're just naturally going to win the point fight. So there's like a timer where the great swords have to get value, and it has to be honestly pretty early, or else the comp can just lose if the point team gets blown up. So that's just something else that the Eagle can play for, but they're still not like slotting stuff like Bile, which you could throw towards point, get a lot of value there. I didn't see like a lot of nades like going off towards point because I had to peel for the backline so much. So it's just like naturally, it felt like awkward, I guess. Their Ego like historically from an attack perspective is very very good in fort, but generally is worse outside. Like 15k, I would consider to be like a probably like a if supple and dropouts are A tier, ego is B tier. 15k would be very very bottom of B or like kind of higher C tier from an NA side, and 15k held egoed on when 15k had a defense versus egoed, which is honestly ages ago at this point, for 15 minutes outside when egoed had like a little bit better of a roster because they could pick exactly who they wanted because it wasn't just people on like who are on EU kind of side. Um, so it's just like there's that aspect where ego historically outside is a little bit worse when their stuff doesn't go their way, but inside ego generally wins. They weren't actually able to like win this point or the fort like at all. Uh, the EU side just kind of dropped down. Like Badgers kind of got on them early. They got the horn buffs going. There was no way for them to easily break the gates, which is something that's very different from NA. I think NA company is very scared of doing that because there's a decent chance that you can lose the war if you time it poorly. Realistically, I think that chance is a lot smaller than people think, and I think that's a risk that people should be more willing to take. It's just something that NA wasn't really able to punish this time around, which also kind of comes back to comp because NA comp better just at stand-up brawls, EU comp a little bit better at space control. So it's like you have to play to your win con to a degree. NA wise, you're trying to make as many ball fights as possible. You should be winning those ball fights if you're playing properly. But there's just like things that are happening that don't really make sense. Like this death doesn't really make a lot of sense. The Zerg is from the kill squad on EU. It just honestly gets out of control, and there's no one protecting the backline from the NA side. Probably 5 minutes into the war, towards the end of the war, it's just the main thing that changed is Bo started playing the backline a little bit more. You saw people from the melee side start to go in EU's backline, and once people start having that like 50-50, both healers are contested. There's less heals across the board in general. That's where the AoE heal tends to shine a little bit because the AoE just has to dump the cooldown and doesn't have to constantly heal. That's where the point group can kind of take over and start to gap the EU side, but it took a while for those pieces to get developed because of the kind of lack of healer pressure combined on people not peeling effectively for the backline. Which I don't know how you peel versus like a 4 greatsword thing. To be honest, it's just like it's rough, but BB plus bows tends to work. Do you have other rules that can help out too at times? It just kind of depends. If you put too many people in the backline, you're just obviously not going to get as much value. I think NA is also adapting this and starting to run more, or Ego just adapting this and is going to try to run more greatswords, which Dropouts has been running for a greatsword. Ego ran 2. Some of the great swords that Ego are running, to be honest, might be washed. I'm not sure if how much Tej has been playing the game, but he's very, very good if he's on his game, and I imagine that they'll be able to slot like really good great swords for those roles to do that job and kind of match that. So I imagine the next wars will be closer because Ego, like towards the end here, identifies the issue, peels for backline, goes aggro on the other team's backline, has people play how they want to play. Like you want the ranged players to be using the ranged aspect, right? Not playing up front and center like a melee. So it just like made more sense towards the end, but there are still like things that generally were getting too much value from the EU side, and I imagine will take a while to fix. I think, or what I would expect is after over time, this like kind of tier list that Micah threw together, I think Ego will end up kind of in the area between Para and Ronaldo, or maybe a little bit ahead of Para, if they really get their stuff together. But based off the roster that they sent over, I'd expect them to be like in this between B and A tier once they get their stuff together. It just does not look like they have their stuff together today, and or I guess not today, but like a few days ago. And that will hopefully get better. The other thing to take in consideration too is this is like the most favorable time for an NA war versus EU. Like I was watching a Man City game. Like every player that was in the EU, like I don't know why you played the war and you weren't watching the Champions League final because that's like the this from an NA perspective, that is like the Super Bowl of EU, except that's like so much bigger than the Super Bowl. So I don't know why people were in this war. I think they had people filling. They had like all kinds of like roster shenanigans. Like I'm not sure if they ended up with this comp on paper, but this is like the original comp that they had set out to be run, which is a very balanced comp. It's good overall. You have like a very tanky point team as long as your quad groups play close to point, and then you have good flank control with your 8, 9, and 10. Then this comp definitely works. You just have like a little bit worse space control on the very edge of point, but that doesn't really matter as much in my opinion as like the backline harass potential. So honestly, this comp is like pretty good. The This group 8 used to be run for NA. It got dropped for a normal group at a certain point because the great swords weren't able to generate enough pressure. So that's something to note. But I think that the comp wise is very balanced. It's just the fact that Egod wasn't able to win versus a company that should on paper be about their level, or if not a little bit below their level on paper, based off of like roster talent on the day that a lot of their players from the EU side are probably not playing to war because they're watching the Man City versus Inter game is just crazy. So yeah, I don't really know, like, on top of that, like, where you go from there. Like, this is probably the easiest war that Ego will ever have versus EU, to be honest. So they get to, but they did get to Fort, right? Which is like a really big difference in Para. Like Para, when it came to NA, like Para got 1 point, I think, as a peak, and they had 5 wars, and that peak was after dropouts got trashed on by Supple. Dropouts people were literally not joining VC. People drinking on mic, had people like doing whatever on mic. So it's just not a serious war, and they still only got 1 point off of that. Shot caller wasn't a VC, didn't have a respawn color. Like everything was stacked towards Par's favor, which is kind of like this war. But Ego is able to pull it together. They're able to get to Fort. Uh, Honestly, kind of disappointing from Badgers that they're not able to shut it out and kind of keep the mental together there. But uh, it's still like a very, very good showing from them, obviously, and a poor showing from NA. So yeah, I don't but it's just like once the bows start peeling, then a lot of this stuff makes more sense. Also, this like light greatsword double in group 9, I feel like you split that up a little bit better, but that's more of a niche thing. It's mostly the where are Ego's bows was like my biggest question from watching the actual what do you call them, VOD, the Farmer John VOD. There also is just like some like very interesting kind of poor tasted fights. Like I'm pretty sure there's a fight around here where Farmer John's like 1v3 and NA is not able to get the kill, and that's just like, come on, guys, it's not that hard. But he has a good survivability build, so you gotta give him credit for that. He's like the Yagu, the Debit of EU, I imagine. So he's leading kill squad. He has a very tanky build. It's more disruption oriented, but in many ways it's a better disruption, a little bit less tanky, but it still definitely works, even though it's a little bit quirky at times. He's just playing for slows. People run away. They can't run as far because they're slowed, and dodge mechanics is how that currently works. So it's generally just not going to work as well. The ranked is cope since 30 to 50% of the T-Baguette roster are Mango to Par Arts, GCB. Yeah, that's what I was told too, and that's why I was like, this I don't think is like super on par like off the bat. That's what, and then I think the KDS is just like kind of a meme, like you can't beat the guys that are preventing people from pushing kind of joke. So it's like whatever. So you think at that point that if you take out the alts, which to be real, if you took out the alts from Egod would also not be a B tier company. Probably they'd be like a upper C tier company. But that's just because Supple and Dropouts have just the majority of good players, which is like the same thing with Mara and Par, right? So it's like from an Egod perspective, like the I'd say the top like if I look at top 20 players, I would say like 15 of those are supple or dropouts, and then 10 of those are egoed, and then the rest are good players, but they're not like the players that win the war, right? And it's the bottom 15 is usually what, or the bottom 25 of roster is what makes a war won or lost. It's not the top 25 usually. It's like not a game where people could hard carry, typically, but people can definitely throw wars. So that's like the big thing that I kind of saw from that, but I don't think that's a huge deal overall. It's just mostly the if you don't peel for healers, then stuff doesn't work. And great swords just generally do win versus the IGBB if the IGBB don't have support, because IGBB inherently is countered by great sword because of showers. Bows have to peel for them at a greater range, and if stuff doesn't sync up like that, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to run a comp that was run the way it was run, in my opinion. Like the way it was run at that point versus like a greatsword comp, you might as well just not have the IGBBs in the backline, just send everyone into Badger's backline and then hope for the best of the giant brawl, which is sort of what happened on point, to be honest. But there just wasn't a lot of heals on point. But yeah, that's what I think about that for the most part. It was to be honest, it was closer than I expected after healing for 20 minutes. I got fort camped. If that was a dropouts war, if we don't get into the first 2 points after 20 minutes, we probably don't try the rest of the war and people mental boom. So kind of props to Egoed for that. But I think Par kind of went through the same thing where it's like they're a super roster but not a super roster, and then Ego, I'd say, is a super roster but not is not a super roster. They definitely have like a lot of the good players. It's just the kind of the synergy going against companies that don't just roll over. That's like from recent history, I guess from last 6 months. I thought it was a year, but I guess it's like technically 6 months has not been present. Like I think the closest competition was probably 15K with a 15-minute outside point hold and then got caved in, and nothing else has been close. I think 15K has been fort held twice, so or like 2 point held twice. So they're just not really competition.